Good evening. Welcome to today's webinar, The Impact of COVID-19 on COPD Research. Today's the 6th live webinar since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. We've covered COVID-19 basics, answered questions about how COVID-19 impacts COPD management, and provided practical tips for maintaining your emotional well-being, exercising, and using telehealth. Today, as much of the COVID conversation has shifted to how to resume daily life, we want to acknowledge that these conversations look different for our community, and we want you to know that the COPD Foundation team will continue to provide relevant information that can help you make informed decisions, stay active, and stay healthy while continuing to prevent exposure to COVID-19. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. You've joined the presentation listening through your computer's speaker system by default. If you prefer to join audio over the telephone, just select phone call in the audio section of your control panel and the dial-in information will be displayed. You can submit text questions at any time by typing them into the questions box of your control panel. We will spend a few minutes at the end addressing as many as we can, and if we aren't able to get to your question during our time today, we will work with our experts to answer them separately and post them on the blog. The slide presentation is provided for you as a handout. You can locate that in the handout section of your control panel. Click on the title and it will open in a separate window for you to download and save it. And before we kick off with the formal program, I'd like to introduce Corinne Costa-Davis, the COPD Foundation CEO, to provide opening remarks.
Thanks, Jamie. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. We have another powerful agenda to share. I would like to thank our presenters, Byron Thomashaw, Bob Wise, Ruth Talsinger, and James Kiley, who will share with you some very interesting and powerful information. And I'd like to give a special thanks to Jamie for spearheading these webinars and bringing the medical, scientific, and patient communities together. So again, Jamie, thank you, and I will turn it over to you.
Great, thank you, Corinne, and once again, welcome. So to start, I'd like to remind everyone that the information presented on this webinar should not serve as substitute for medical advice, and any content discussed should not be used for medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Please consult with a physician before making changes to your own COPD management plan, and if you have any concerns about COVID-19 symptoms. We will be making the recording of today's webinar available on our website. The information presented on today's webinar about COVID-19 was current as of today, June 16th, but the information about the disease and the recommendations discussed today are changing rapidly. And if you're viewing the recording of the webinar, the information may no longer be accurate. So let's get started. Today, after covering important updates related to COVID-19 transmission and treatment and vaccine development, we will shift our focus to research and explore what has happened to COPD research since the start of the pandemic and what it will take to restart important clinical trials. We'll hear about the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute's response to COVID-19, how research studies have been affected, and how the COPD Foundation has responded, including highlights from the recently concluded COPD and COVID-19 survey number 2. The presentations have been informed by your questions. However, we recognize it's impossible to cover everything. So please rest assured if your question's not answered again today, we will continue to consult with our medical and scientific experts and will be providing additional content online and in future webinars. These topics will be covered by a panel of world-class medical experts. We are again joined by Dr. Byron Thomashaw, a practicing pulmonologist and professor of medicine at Columbia University Medical Center and the COPD Foundation's Chief Medical Officer. Next, we'll hear from Dr. James Kiley, the Director of the Division of Lung Diseases at the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute and a longtime champion for the COPD community. Next, we'll hear from Dr. Bob Wise. He's a professor of medicine at Johns Hopkins University and chairs the COPD Foundation's Medical and Scientific Advisory Committee. Finally, we'll hear from Dr. Ruth Talsinger, who spent her career working in COPD research and development and is currently the COPD Foundation's Chief Scientific Strategy Officer. As you can see, we've got an incredible wealth of expertise with us here again. So without further ado, let's kick it off with Dr. Thomashaw.
Thank you, Jamie. First slide, please. So as everyone knows, this is not over yet, unfortunately. Worldwide, there are now over 8 million cases, over 430,000 deaths. The figures are really staggering. This week, the CDC released a report ranging from January 22nd to May 30th of some 1.7 million cases in this country. 14% of them had been hospitalized, 2% had ended up in the ICU, 5% of them had died. The hospitalization rate was much higher in those with other comorbid conditions, other medical problems, the most common being cardiovascular at 32%, diabetes at 30%. The evidence suggested that chronic lung diseases, and COPD is one of those, was in the 15 to 18% range. As you can see in the map, some of the places around the country have stabilized, while many others are continuing to range. This is a problem going forward. Next slide, please. Prevention remains the key. And while we understand that older folks and those with comorbid conditions are at greater risk, there are other factors, environmental factors, exposure factors that are important. Those include enclosed spaces, large crowds, the amount of time you are exposed, and particularly exposure to people who are coughing, sneezing, shouting, singing. If we could avoid those issues alone, we would make real progress. There was a report out of Lancet, which was a large systematic review with a meta-analysis that reinforced the fact that face masks and social distancing works. Since we don't have a therapy and we don't have a vaccine yet, those are critically important issues. Last week, the World Health Organization announced a new face mask guideline. The general public should wear cloth masks in public spaces where physical distancing is not possible. In addition, people over 60 or with pre-existing conditions should wear medical masks in areas where there is community spread and distancing is not possible. The WHO announcement was last week was somewhat complicated and confusing because they suggested that there was little risk in those people who are asymptomatic. Many experts around the world objected to that and worried about that recommendation. And indeed, the WHO did take some steps back from that. WHO raised the somewhat complicated issue of asymptomatic versus pre-symptomatic. Asymptomatic is someone who is infected but never develops symptoms, and clearly there are people who fall into that group, while pre-symptomatic involves those people who are infected, don't have symptoms at the time, but develop symptoms at a later point, oftentimes within several days, and that group in particular may be a risk for spread. In any case, we don't have an answer here, and people should remain cautious and follow the precautions that are available, because that's the best thing that we can do right now. Next slide, please. Vaccines. Those are ultimately our best hope. We're not there yet. Currently, there are 10 vaccine candidates in development around the world that are beginning human trials. That's about as fast as you could possibly imagine. Reports suggest that some of those could be ready for large-scale testing as soon as July. Phase 3 trials involve some 30,000 volunteers for each candidate vaccine, half of whom will receive placebo. The goal of these larger trials is to define safety and potential effectiveness based upon the level of antibody formation. The hope is, and it is a hope, is to have at least one effective vaccine and safe vaccine by 2021. That would be the fastest, as far as I know, that we've ever developed a vaccine. We're not there yet, but we are making progress. Several older vaccines are also being looked at. There's an old TB vaccine called BCG, and of course there's the old oral polio vaccine. The rationale there, what I understand, would be to boost the immune system to try to fight off viruses. We're not there yet. It's too early to tell whether these will have a role, but again, it's an example of the many things that people are looking at. Next slide, please. Remdesivir, as we've mentioned at prior webinars, is an antiviral agent. Preliminary results indicate that patients treated with remdesivir had a 31% faster time to recovery than those who received placebo. Now remember, remdesivir is not an oral agent for outpatient use. It's an intravenous medication which is used in those people who are really quite sick in the hospital. But based upon this result and other studies, remdesivir has received FDA emergency use authorization for treatment of COVID-19. Patients receive either a 5-day or a 10-day regimen depending upon the severity of the disease. This is a potential therapy that could help. Availability of the drug is an increasing concern. Reports suggest that Gilead, the company that makes the drug, is ramping up to make more, but it's unclear how much will be available this summer. They are working at it. Next slide, please. Other medication. There has obviously been a great deal of interest in hydroxychloroquine Several published papers over the last week have been retracted because of concerns about data. You know, as we rush information into the press, some of the peer review is not as strong as it was in the past. That's something which is really important. However, it is worth stressing that none of the large published studies have confirmed any significant benefit, and many have stressed potential adverse effects. In addition, a recent publication showed no evidence that hydroxychloroquine is helpful in preventing COVID-19. The study looked at over 800 participants, all with direct exposure, 2/3 being healthcare providers and remainder household contacts. Volunteers received either 5 days of the drug or placebo, and there was no statistical difference between the two groups. On June 15th, just 2 days ago, the FDA revoked the emergency use authorization it had previously issued for hydroxychloroquine use. We need more. I want to say a word or two about famotidine, in part because it's received so much information, so much interest in the lay press. As you know, famotidine is a drug that's been available for years to treat GERD, reflux. In computer models, there has been some suggestion of a potential mechanism of action of this drug in COVID-19. And in a very small case series of non-hospitalized patients with COVID-19 symptoms, patients felt better after taking 1 to 2 days of famotidine, and symptoms cleared within 14 days without apparent side effects. But I want to stress, and it's really important, this is a very small study, the results are very preliminary, and the drug is being given at much higher doses than we ordinarily use this drug. All drugs have potential side effects. We're not ready to say that this is a drug that will help or not, but it's important to know that work like this is ongoing. One final trial that I just want to talk about briefly, the results were just released earlier today. It's a UK, United Kingdom-based pragmatic trial, which suggested that Decadron, a steroid medication in relatively low dose, could reduce death rates in hospitalized patients with severe COVID-19, particularly in those patients who were receiving mechanical ventilation, where there was a 1/3 reduction in death rate. In those who were not on mechanical ventilation but requiring oxygenation, the drug caused a drop of 1/5, 20% reduction. Now, again, this is very early, this is very preliminary, but I would stress with you that a tremendous amount of work is ongoing looking for potential suggestions, potential options. Next slide, please. And finally, other therapies. There's been a lot of interest, as you all know, on convalescent plasma donated by people who've recovered from COVID-19. Again, within the last week, there was a multi-center randomized trial from China early on in the epidemic between February and April that was released. Among patients with severe or life-threatening COVID-19, convalescent plasma therapy added to standard therapy, compared with standard therapy alone, did not reveal statistically significant improvement in 28 days. I would stress with you that the interpretation is limited because the study was stopped early. So only 103 of the total planned 200 cases were recruited because by that time in China, the COVID-19 epidemic had improved and new cases were difficult to recruit. The study did suggest that the plasma therapy was associated with some clinical improvement in those patients who were severely ill but not critically ill. It's again a hope going forward. More studies are underway. The U.S. government awarded AstraZeneca $23 million within the last week or two to develop antibody therapy. I would stress with everything that I've mentioned that it's why this particular webinar is so important, because our future depends upon appropriate good research. That's what this webinar is about. Thank you, Jamie.
Thank you, Dr. Tomashow, for sharing these important and hopeful updates. The importance of clear public health communication, I think it's very evident this week, as always, and we appreciate you clarifying what the public should take away from the WHO report and the coverage of these new studies. So now we're going to shift to Dr. Kiley, who is going to talk about the NHLBI response, and I'm going to bring up your slides. Okay. Okay, take it away, Dr. Kiley.
Okay, thanks very much, Jamie, and thank you for the invitation to be here. It's a real pleasure to have a chance to talk with you, and I think the end of Byron's talk is a nice segue into what I want to tell you a little bit about and that has to do with the NHLBI response to the COVID-19 challenge that we're facing, major public health problem that we're all really rallying around to try to find solutions. I know the topic of this webinar is how has prior non-COVID research been impacted by the virus and by the challenge and pandemic. And I would have to say, just in a nutshell, that almost everything has been either delayed, postponed, or in some way halted to be able to really focus most, if not all, of our resources around trying to deal with the pandemic. There are some things going on, but a lot of it is being driven by local policies at institutions where they may or may not be allowing research all the way from very basic science up to clinical research and outreach research, community-based research. So much of it is really driven by that, but it's also there are also policies that have been stated and placed on the NIH website around what is underway and what's not. For what I wanted to do in the next 10 minutes or so is to just rather than focus on what we can't do, focus on what we can do and how we are rallying around the important priorities that we have set in NHLBI for dealing with the COVID-19 crisis. Next slide, please. So I don't have to tell this group that the NHLBI is truly in the center of this entire pandemic. This is a disease, a problem that affects our major organ systems. In every single way you can imagine, it affects the lungs. There's a lot of cardiovascular involvement. We know the receptors that are involved here are very much in the space that regulates renin-angiotensin. And we know how important the blood system is with respect to coagulopathy, thrombosis, and you just heard around convalescent plasma, as well as various anti-clotting kinds of approaches that may be important for combating the disease. But probably equally important is those with underlying health conditions, such as chronic lung disease, cardiovascular disease, diabetes. These are the same things Byron just mentioned to you, are at very, very high risk for this disease. So not only do we have a virus that's an equal opportunity employer, but it also seems to be very preferential to those who have those underlying comorbidities and are most vulnerable. So this is really why NHLBI really feels like it has to stand up tall and really take a major lead role in trying to look for solutions to this problem. Next slide, please. So very early on, we came up with our strategy. This may look somewhat similar to our kind of standard approach to how we deal with various research problems, but we felt like we needed to really be pretty broad and expansive here. And so understanding the pathophysiology to identify new treatments, test host-directed interventions that would provide the evidence base for clinical practice. And I want to sort of underscore this one more than any, because we believe in NHLBI that this is really where we need to lean in a heavy-duty way. By that, I mean that we should focus much of our resources around really doing something that can impact patient care immediately or in the near term. You heard a little bit about blood safety, serosurveillance, and looking for blood-derived therapeutics. Kind of goes hand in hand with the host-directed interventions. We also have a wealth of assets in cohort studies across NHLBI, and we think that we can also learn a lot about the natural history of this virus by tapping into those longitudinal cohort studies to understand more about the natural history and risk factors. And then, as most of you know, we are very deep into behavioral, social, and community-based interventions, and we have a need for a biospecimen repository to provide not only those specimens that we can collect, but also a home for the vast amounts of data that are going to be amassed over the next 6 to 12 months around the various studies that are being supported. Next slide, please. So here's a look at, in a thumbnail or a snapshot, the timeline of key events that sort of have driven our strategic approach. And I won't spend a ton of time on all of this, but I do want to leave you with the idea that we really got started very, very early in the Institute. And you can see dating back all the way to middle of February when we started to see the uptick in this country and some of the characteristics coming out of China, that NHLBI began to really organize itself around what our approach would be. And you could see that very soon after that publication and our knowledge of what was happening outside the U.S., that we released a notice of special interest in early March. And that was our way of alerting the community that we wanted to support research that would deal with the COVID crisis. And this NOCI that we call them is focused around preclinical translational research. It generated an enormous response. We have over 500 applications that we're looking through at right now and trying to make some awards very soon. We've had multiple roundtables that have helped us identify what clinical trials we might do, how we might approach registries and observational studies. And then, as most of you know, the Congress passed the CARES Act. And as part of our preparatory activities in NHLBI, we were very fortunate to receive $104 million to combat this problem directly to the NHLBI because we had a strategic plan that was ready to implement. Very soon after that occurred, we launched the first clinical trial in NHLBI. This was done through our PEDAL network, which is our prevention and early intervention for acute lung injury. And that's the trial that's underway right now called ORCID. That's testing hydroxychloroquine. And you can see that in early April, we began that trial. Right now, that trial has enrolled about 450 subjects, patients. We expect to reach our sample size of about 520 or so by the end of this month. And so we're looking forward to seeing the results of that study. And in the face of all of the literature and small and somewhat anecdotal studies that are coming out of around hydroxychloroquine, our monitoring board is actively watching this study. We've got multiple interim analyses being done, so we're really very much on top of it. I just want to quickly zip through the last part of this slide, which is to pivot a little bit around the public-private partnership that Dr. Collins and NIH had started. It's called ACTIVE. This is really an effort to begin to bring a lot of the industry, academia, the private sector together to really mount a massive effort around both therapy as well as preventative strategies, data resource efforts, and a number of different programs, too many for me to illustrate. And I think if you're really interested in this, I'd certainly urge you to go to the NIH website. But in the meantime, NHLBI released several more initiatives looking for observational research, looking for additional clinical research, particularly phase 1, 2B, 2A kinds of studies, and a large initiative that is really all about establishing a network of networks that will do intervention studies that are targeting the host. I just want to point out several studies, as I said, have already started. I mentioned ORCID already. The Cole-Corona study is testing colchicine. That's a study we're doing in conjunction with our Canadian colleagues in CIHR. We've already started several epidemiological or observational studies. CORAL is one on inpatients. It's a retrospective and a prospective study being done mostly through our PEDAL network. We also have a serosurveillance study that's going on through our REDS program. This is our big biospecimen repository. And then we're about to launch our trial on convalescent plasma anytime now. So you'll be seeing that begin to start. Next, please. So I want to just pivot quickly and say that we're turning our strategy into action by releasing a number of these special notices as well as different initiatives to try to bring research to the community, engage the community, both at the patient level all the way up through the academic community, and to really develop this diverse portfolio that's in response to this pandemic. Next, please. So one of the challenges that we have encountered here is how do we take advantage of all the assets that we have in NHLBI? And one of the things that we have is a number of networks and programs, and you can see the labels or their a little bit of their acronyms on this slide. But one of the things that we came up with was, can we take all of these assets and link them together in a coordinated way that would make an integrated and adaptive approach across our networks and cohort studies that would allow us to build this network of networks to have amazing capacity to be able to answer a wide range of questions that focus on host-directed therapies. And so one of our goals in our big clinical trials program is to build this network of networks, and that's what we're actively working on right now. Next slide, please. At the same time, I also mentioned the longitudinal and other cohort studies. As I said, we have a lot of assets in this space as well, and we want to tie together as many of our cohort studies across heart, lung, and blood to be able to really begin to understand natural history, look at predictive biomarkers, look at ways to stratify patients. We really are very anxious to see if we can leverage the electronic health record and the digital platform that provides to allow us to scrape data, almost in real time, and put that into a repository that's accessible to the research community, that where questions could be asked in real time and probed based on that data that's been collected. So there's a lot of work going on around how do we best build this this cohort of cohorts. It's somewhat like our network of networks, so that we can have this rich data come in that'll allow us to not only identify the clinical course of COVID, but also identify predictive risk factors. Next, please. Next slide, please. So it's really going to take a family here. This is not going to be just one organization like NHLBI that's going to be able to mount this massive effort. It's really a circle of partners that goes across the entire ecosystem, from the public, from the academic community, our researchers, the government agencies, all the professional societies, industry, and it cuts across borders. There's no question that we need to work as a global community here. So I mentioned the active partnership, which is driven by NIH through the Foundation for NIH, but it's also a very, very big effort to tie all of these groups together, government, industry, academia, to really make progress in a substantive way, in a timely way, and as rapidly as we can. Most of our efforts and attention over the past 4 months or so have really been totally immersed and directed towards putting together all of the infrastructure and linking up all of these partners in a way that we can then quickly activate research protocols, test promising therapies, look for ways in which we can prevent the disease, and find vaccines that will actually help us with any future waves of this coronavirus. Next slide, please. So I will just leave you with a few links and resources. You have these slides, but I would urge you to get to stay up to date. Look at the NIH website, look at the NHLBI website. Byron's already given you data from CDC, and you can learn about active through, again, the NIH website. There's a host of resources there, and it gives you up to date, almost daily information on what's going on, how you can participate, and where you can get more information. So I think that's the last slide. Maybe one more just to say thank you very much. From all of us in NHLBI, we hope that all of you are staying safe and healthy during these difficult times. And I hope that at the same time you stay in touch with us. We really don't want to lose track or lose touch with the patient community, with the public, and with certainly our researchers. So we are open. We're all working mostly from home, but don't hesitate to reach out, because we really want to hear from you. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Dr. Kiley, and a big thank you to all of your colleagues at the NIH for working to advance a great COVID-19 strategy while also trying to ensure the important work underway related to COPD can move forward eventually. So thank you again. Now we're going to hear from Dr. Bob Wise, who will give us more insight into how decisions around COPD research were made and what we need to consider moving forward.
Thank you very much, Jamie. What I'd like to get across today is the story of what's happened over the last few months to COPD research, not necessarily COVID research, but to give you some idea of how this has affected the entire research enterprise, clinical as well as basic. First of all, on or around March 17th, institutions around the country were engaged in preparations for the COVID emergency, and essentially over the course of several days shut down all outpatient research for patients who had COPD and a variety of other diseases. So what happened was essentially in-person study visits to research facilities were stopped. This was largely because of safety concerns for patients participating in research to prevent them from being exposed or to unnecessarily have risk of exposure to COVID. Now, this involved thousands and thousands of research protocols. At Johns Hopkins, it involved 4,300 clinical research protocols that were shut down in the course of 2 days. The institutional review boards that have oversight for clinical research had to review study by study to make sure that there were no studies where patients were being harmed by not participating in research. And so in those cases, patients were permitted to come in if they needed treatment for serious conditions that might be stopped, if they needed safety assessments and so on. But I would say that the vast majority of clinical research ground to a halt in the middle of March. Studies were, however, permitted and even encouraged to continue research using non-in-person visits. There was a vast expansion, a 1,000-fold expansion of the use of telemedicine clinically, and also telemedicine and telephonic visits to patients who were participating in research. All of this involved reconstruction of the entire research enterprise, including research involving COPD, over the course of just a few weeks. And I can tell you from my own experience, this involved all of us who were working from our homes, having lots of Zoom meetings, working 24/7 to rewrite our protocols, to bring them to the institutional review boards, to notify our patients what was going on, and to institute all of these revisions. Community research, where investigators were going to the home to visit people, was essentially ground to a halt. COPD research and respiratory disease research in particular was affected because of the fact that procedures such as spirometry, CPAP, BiPAP, which are important adjuncts and clinical outcomes of pulmonary research, were considered AGPs, or aerosol generating procedures. And because this required considerable environmental controls and required the use of personal protective equipment, at the time that these procedures were stopped, there was a lack of knowledge and a lack of supplies to do these procedures, and therefore this had a particularly important influence on lung disease research. Next slide, please. So there was a tremendous adaptation, as I said, by the biomedical research community to try to revamp studies, and there was transition over a matter of weeks of major studies such as Capture COPD, which you see here, Spiromics, COPD Gene, and others, to entirely digital study visits. Blood work and other measures were continued only if they impacted patient safety. And there was also a adoption of measures to determine the effect of this COVID-19 public health emergency on patients with COPD and other lung diseases. And that's not only COVID disease itself, but also the effects of the quarantine on patients' behavioral, psychological, and social well-being. A number of major COPD research studies then took on the job of surveilling patients for adverse effects of the COVID emergency, as well as the virus itself. So one of the things that's been striking is the speed with which all of these changes took place. Normally, what would take a year or two to institute took place in a matter of weeks. And it was truly a remarkable effort by researchers, by institutional review boards, by research review committees, by funding agencies, investigators, and also participants in research studies to recognize what was happening and to participate and cooperate. Now, if I could have the next slide, I want to go over the way that research is going to reopen, because there's been a lot of planning now, although research was shut down, as I said, in many cases in a matter of days. Research is going to reopen gradually, we think, over the next few months. It's going to be different for sure, and it's going to be very staged and thoughtful. First of all, in many places, basic science laboratories are reopening or ramping up. Many of these laboratories continued at a low pace during the initial phases of the COVID emergency, particularly where there were ongoing important experiments that were ongoing. As the research laboratories are reopening, there are very stringent social distancing practices that are going on, such that there will be a minimum number of staff working in a laboratory. If you've ever been to many of the busy research laboratories in institutions throughout the United States, you'd see that people are working elbow to elbow in very small spaces, and this is obviously not appropriate at the present time. So what is happening is there are criteria for how many people can work in a particular space at one time. This involves shift work, and many laboratories, particularly the busy ones, are now on a 24-hour schedule where people are coming in 12-hour shifts and working in the day or the night, very dedicated people. As far as clinical research goes, much of this is conducted in clinical space, and it involves appropriate steps to protect both patients and and their caregivers, as well as healthcare providers. The way that this research is going to be phased in is much like the phases that you see as the country is reopening, but there's prioritization of therapeutic trials that where there's no other treatment other than the therapy, and that involves the COVID studies that get high priority, then trials where there is a comparison treatment that that is available. And then finally, interventional studies that involve behavior or non-pharmacologic therapy. And finally, observational studies are going to be opened as the next wave. So there is a plan. It's a very detailed plan. It's a little different for every institution, but there's going to be a staged reopening of research. Nonetheless, research is forever going to be changed after this, and I believe that research studies will involve digital involvement, telephonic and telehealth communications far more than they have in the past. Could I have the next slide, please? So the things that are important to COPD is, as I said, many COPD studies involve spirometry or lung function that can be so-called aerosol generating procedures. They need very stringent environmental controls and will be limited in research institutes. There's a tremendous interest now in having patients doing home spirometry monitoring, and a number of devices are being used for that. Every institution is going to be developing its own time schedule and criteria for restarting, and that depends a lot on how much community spread there is, as well as local practices and requirements. There are some things that are good about this. I don't want to leave anybody thinking that this has been a disaster for research, because one thing that we've learned from this is that clinical research can change and can be conducted and brought online with amazingly good speed, as long as there's cooperation and the technology that we have available to us. The FDA, for example, has been able to review drugs as well as devices that are not only COVID related, but respiratory devices at great speed and with great efficiency. NIH and other research organizations have been able to develop proposals and fund research also with great speed and efficiency. And these learnings are going to continue, I think, in the future. The next slide is my final slide, and I just want everyone here to understand that research is going to be safe in the future, that nobody is going to be requesting people to participate if their well-being is not preserved, and that's the primary thing that's driving all of these changes. So if participants choose to participate in research, you can be confident that that it's going to be done with safety in mind. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks so much, Dr. Wise. It certainly is reassuring to hear how patient safety is leading the way and as important decisions are made. So we appreciate you sharing the thought processes that are going on behind the scenes. Okay, our final presentation will be from the COPD Foundation's own Dr. Ruth Tausinger. Ruth, take it away.
Thank you, Jamie. If we go to the next slide. So for those of you who are not familiar with the research strategy of COPD Foundation, I'll be talking about COPD 360 a little bit because that is the engine that drives our scientific research, including what I will be presenting today. And this connects and mobilizes partnerships. As Dr. Kiley told you, the network is what's important here, and we can't do our work alone. So we partnered with patients, with caregivers, with healthcare professionals, with researchers, both in academia and academic institution and health systems, as well as government agency and industry partners, to really go together under a common mission of improving the lives of individuals living with COPD and related lung diseases. So if we look at the circle on the right, this is just an example of how COPD 360 is at the heart of everything that we do, starting from the right, COPD 360 social community with about 48,000 participants from around the world. The COPD to the left, Patient Power Research Network, with about, I think, 8,900 individual participants. And then at the bottom, bronchiectasis and NTM research registry. And to the right, as Dr. Kiley actually mentioned, the NHLBI study called COPD Gene that started with 10,000 participants. So all along, we have about 50 or 60,000 individuals that are lending their voice to our research initiatives. If we go to the next slide, please. COPD 360 allowed us to respond to COVID-19 very quickly using surveys, both to physicians as well as to our rest of our community about the impact of the pandemic on the community. So in early March, we launched our first surveys, both to clinicians as well as the one listed here, to the network on COPD 360 Social and other networks that we reached out to. And we started asking questions to help us develop resources and programs that address the needs of our community. We wanted to hear your voice. We wanted to know what you needed research to help you with. So the first survey we reported and published online in April and also presented it at a webinar at the end of April. The survey that I'll describe today, we launched it on May 1st and it continued till the end of May. We had 776 individuals that participated in it. And today we'll tell you some of the results. And we could plan to continue doing these surveys, and the next survey sometime in August or September as countries open up and we want to understand what is happening after the isolation of the initial response to COVID-19. We're very, very grateful to all the respondents, but also to the industry partners who supported the work that was done that we'll be looking at today. So if we go to the next slide, please, Jamie. So first is who participated in the survey. We had 726 participants from the United States, 18 from Europe, 15 from Canada, and 11 from other countries all around the world. We had Australia, India, Israel, Pakistan, lots of respondents from different countries, not too many, but we really appreciate everything that people provided. At the bottom table, we're looking at 634 individuals who tagged either COPD, emphysema, or chronic bronchitis. 87 of those individuals did not tag that they were diagnosed with COPD. Then we're going to alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency, which is a genetic form of COPD. We had 31 respondents and 19 reported that they also had COPD. To the right, bronchiectasis and non-tuberculous mycobacterial infection, we had 211 respondents and 130 of them were tagged also that they had COPD. We know that these are related diseases. We also had 13 responses from caregivers of an individual who lives with COPD. If we go to the next slide, please. The results that I'll present now are available online in the COPD Digest article. So the first response was to the questions around diagnosis of COVID-19. Out of 595 COPD respondents, 37 who responded to the question said that a healthcare professional told them that they had COVID-19. They reported symptoms such as most of them shortness of breath, 71% reported cough, and 35% reported fever. In our previous survey, we saw more fever, but this is what we're seeing in this one. Out of those 37, 16 individuals with COPD were tested for COVID-19, and 2 reported that the test came back positive. Those 2 were hospitalized for over 1 week, but have since recovered. 126 individuals said that they experienced a COPD exacerbation in the last 5 months, which is a bit more than what they said that they experienced in 2019, a year before COVID-19. Here we're looking at 5 months versus 12 months, but we do see quite a few exacerbations, also accepting that we are in spring and in winter we see more exacerbations. We asked patients and participants in general how they felt about COVID-19. So 98% of 553 people said that they were concerned and extremely concerned. And you see in the pie chart, the orange is extremely concerned. 58% of them are very, very worried, especially as it relates to COPD and how they're worried about COVID-19. Go to the next slide, please. So one thing that really helps us inform some of the efforts around public policy was understanding how many of the responders are working. So we asked individuals whether they are essential workers, whether they're considered essential workers, and we saw 79 of them said that they were essential worker, but 53 are still actively working. We're still actively working the time of the survey, and we're extremely grateful for those essential workers that keep us fed and keep our prescriptions filled at pharmacies. And it's really, really important to understand how they felt about COVID-19 and going to work at that time. So lots of good responses. We had 371 people who said they're not employed, but a lot of them are retired, others are too disabled to be able to work. And that helps us understand what we need to do in terms of public policy around employment during this pandemic. Go to the next slide, please. So I think we skipped one. Thank you. So we asked individuals how COVID-19 impacted their daily lives, and the majority of the responses were around changing the way they interacted with family and friends, as well as staying home. And we know a lot of people use Zoom and WebEx and all kinds of technology to communicate with their families, their friends, but also with their healthcare professionals. Lots of them are taking positive measures to stay safe, but if you look at the comments, there are some individuals that are saying, I'm scared, I lack knowledge about my disease and the pandemic, home confinement is increasing my depression. A few caregivers noted how stressful it was to be away from a patient in an assisted living facility, or we had some comments around being away from someone who passed away and they were unable to be with them. So there's definitely something that we need to think about in terms of helping people and supporting them through this. So if we go to the next slide, please. This is pulmonary rehabilitation. So exercise in general is very, very important for our health, but in case of COPD, pulmonary rehabilitation is known to be important in keeping patients feeling better, a sense of well-being, but also keeping them out of the hospital. Pulmonary rehabilitation is an important therapy for COPD. And when we ask the question, have you ever participated or are you participating now in pulmonary rehabilitation, we saw that about 40% experience pulmonary rehabilitation. We would like to see more of them. But one thing that was really notable was that 35 reported that they were participating in the program that was interrupted. Comments highlighted a concern about access to supervised exercise program as well as pulmonary rehabilitation. We had a few respondents that said that they were able to participate in the telemedicine pulmonary rehabilitation and how much they liked it. But the majority of the respondents said that they're worried that they're slipping up, that they have no access to exercise that is supervised, and they're afraid. So the impact of that was that we partnered with experts. We've written a grant application that helps improve the efficiency of telehealth approach to pulmonary rehabilitation. And we are adding COPD 360 peer coaching. We don't know if it's going to be funded, but we'll relentlessly pursue pulmonary rehabilitation and the access to pulmonary rehabilitation. In the meantime, we also added information on our website about maintaining exercise routine at home. Go to the next slide, please. So airway mucus is a big problem for many individuals with COPD, especially those with bronchiectasis and chronic bronchitis. And airway clearance techniques are very, very important in clearing the airways and preventing infection and reducing symptoms. There are a number of airway clearance techniques, including exercises, special techniques for efficient coughing, as well as vests and devices to help release the mucus. So 60% of those with COPD reported at least using one technique. The most common of them is the huff cough. And 77% of bronchiectasis NTM respondents said that they're also using airway clearance techniques. Now, as Dr. Weiss said, containment and aerosolizing of people coughing up something is a concern around COVID-19. And we started thinking about what can we do to educate individuals, first of all, to continue airway clearance techniques, because it's very, very important to continue doing that, but also to do it safely and protecting family members or healthcare professionals from the impact of coughing and reducing the potential of exposure to others. We dedicated, as of yesterday, a web page that we put together with experts in the area coping with airway mucus, and also talked about containment and making sure that it is safe. So if we go to the next slide, please. One of the questions, we asked a number of questions about our programming and what would be helpful in coping better with COVID-19, and you're seeing the responses on the table. It's also available online. But the most common response to the question was a need for help with face mask and selecting the best face covering. There were a lot of comments around exercise again, but face mask, if it's hard to breathe, covering your face is very, very difficult, especially in individuals on oxygen therapy. So we did address that in a blog on April 3rd that is dedicated to face covering. And we also had a recent webinar on maintaining good health through COPD management. This is as we were delivering these surveys, we were also looking at the results and trying to respond as quickly as we can. So my last slide, next slide, is what we're continuing to do. So we have a lot of text responses that we're still analyzing. We did complete the analysis of medications and people's comments on that. We're using machine learning to understand the sentiment of people and to track it over time with our repeated surveys. We also shared the text responses to a lot of the questions with COPD patient investigators on the Bridge project, which is available online, its description. We're posting another article about the bronchiectasis NTM community, and we also partnered with COPD gene investigators and other academic research to work on scientific publications that will help researchers as well as healthcare professionals deal with a lot of the issues that were raised. We will continue to run these surveys. We're extremely grateful to the participants and to the supporters and participants also in the Patient Power Research Worker Network. They're working on the patient journey and trying to understand the impact of COVID-19 on people with COPD and related lung diseases. So this is the end. And again, thank you very much for those who participated in our surveys and in our work.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Talsinger, and thank you to all of you who participated in our survey. Your input is so important to help us plan programs, as you heard, and of course additional research topics, as well as to identify the policy issues that we need to advocate on so that we can be your voice in Washington and in legislative and regulatory policy. So please keep the communication open. All right, so with that, we are just about out of time, but I do believe we have just a couple questions. As a reminder, if you would like to ask a question, please enter it into the question panel, the question box in your control panel, so that we can get to that question for you. And I'm going to go ahead and bring those up now. All right, so our first question is, do we have any information about how COVID is affecting people who have bronchiectasis or NTM? Dr. Tomashaw, do you want to take that one?
I have not seen a lot of information on that. Maybe Bob or Jim have, or Ruth. I will tell you I've had a number of patients with bronchiectasis who have had COVID-19. And thankfully, they've done okay. I think it's important to remember that while we talk a lot about the people who've been hospitalized and end up in ICUs, and God knows that too many people have died, there are many people who can get through this even if you've got an underlying disease. So while the risk is higher and the prevention is really important, I've had a number of patients with fairly significant bronchiectasis who have gotten through this without ending up in the hospital and in the ICU. So it can be done. I've not seen a lot of data. Maybe Bob has, and he can comment on that. The other issue that's related to this, though, and maybe again some of my colleagues can comment upon it, is the issue of whether or not if someone has COVID-19, has a pneumonia with COVID-19, and survives it, God willing, what their chances are of developing longer-term respiratory issues. We saw some of that in the patients who survived SARS and the MERS epidemic. It's something that we need to study and look at. Many people will recover completely, some will linger, and some will have more chronic issues. Bob, any thoughts about either one of those issues?
I have not had any experience or seen any publications about bronchiectasis and COVID-19 disease. I will say, however, we have had some patients with bronchiectasis as the result of other diseases where my colleagues have noted that they have shed the virus for extremely long periods of time, up to 45 days in one case I know of. So it's important to have repeated testing in patients with underlying lung disease until they're clear, particularly those who are on chronic systemic steroids.
Okay.
Thank you. Just as a reminder, before we conclude, if you have any questions, please use the questions box in the chat in the control panel to enter them. Okay, so our next question is, have there been any studies regarding whether or not the TPA clot busters may be effective in treating COVID-19 patients who develop thrombosis or emboli? Sorry.
Well, that's a really complicated question, because obviously the clotting issue here, as Dr. Kiley mentioned earlier, is a really major issue, and we need a lot more research to better define whether or not the therapies that we have will be effective. You know, remember at the beginning of all of this, we were just trying to get through and trying to survive as many patients as we could. We need more information about what's being involved and what's the pathophysiology, how it develops in order to develop an idea of what the best therapies might be. Bob, Jim, any thoughts?
This is Jim. So I would just say that that's spot on, and stay tuned. There's a lot of little small studies that have been emerging around the role of heparin, low molecular weight, other kinds of agents that could be used either in hospital or for prophylactic purposes, or even as in outpatient settings. All of these questions are really being actively looked at right now, and protocols are being developed. NHLBI is leading the anticoagulation protocol for all of NIH. And so you're going to see 2 or 3 master protocols that will come out in the next couple of few weeks at the longest, that will start enrolling patients to really get at some of these questions. So it's a very good question. Hang on. I think the results may be coming, but it's not going to be right away. It's going to take us a little while, but we're on it.
Thank you. We have 2 last questions that are somewhat related, but so the question is, will there be any standardized guidelines that researchers will be able to follow to restart in-person visits? For example, for spirometry or 6-minute walk, and relatedly, you know, what about standardized guidelines for reopening pulmonary rehab programs?
I can take that. The ATS is issuing guidelines about reopening pulmonary function laboratories, and the safest way to do that it will depend to a large extent on the condition of the pandemic in individual locations. Just as a preview, many laboratories are going to request COVID testing prior to pulmonary function testing. Not all of them. It depends on the pandemic in the region and the institution. It's going to be limited in terms of numbers, so not too many people are being tested in tight proximity. There will be spacing out of testing so that rooms can have a chance to clear any aerosols, and staff will be using full personal protective equipment during testing.
Bob, let me just try to address the rehab issue. I think that pulmonary rehab programs, cardiac rehab programs will start to reopen over the months, assuming that the pandemic is controlled in those local areas. I suspect those will look a little different as well, with more spacing between people, et cetera, et cetera. But I want to stress that as much as this is a horrible thing for all of us to go through, there are things we're learning beyond the research world. Telemedicine, if you had asked me 3 or 4 months ago, I would have said, yeah, in places around the country where there's 500 miles between specialists, sure. But in metropolitan areas, probably not, and I've changed my mind. I do believe that telemedicine is an important part of the future, especially if we can develop the technology that allows us to really do what we need to do. I know the Israelis, for example, have developed a virtual stethoscope. There are things we can do with this as we move forward that will make care better. Pulmonary rehab is at the top of that list. I mean, before this ever began, as much as we all believe in pulmonary rehab and how good it is and how worthwhile it is, only 2 to 5% of the millions of people in this country with COPD ever participated in pulmonary rehab. This is an opportunity for us to grow telemedicine rehab, and we need to take advantage of that. So at the end of the day, when we're finally through this and we're all going back and living our lives, everybody around the country would be able to do pulmonary rehab. That should be our goal. Thanks again, Jamie.
Great. Just to sneak in one last question, because it's something we've heard more often lately as the conversation has turned to reopening. We had a question asking, is it safe for people with COPD to return to work now while the pandemic is still ongoing?
No, it's the answer is that life goes on, and I understand that. I think that people with comorbid conditions, as we said at the very beginning of this webinar, are at a greater risk, particularly older people with comorbid conditions. I think that that's a balance that's going to have to be made. Obviously there is, you want to follow the precautions as much as you can. Ideally, and maybe Jim can comment upon this, ideally you'd like to have the testing available where you had antibody testing, for example, that was worthwhile, that worked, that you could trust and know that that meant that you had some degree of protection. We don't have any of those things right now. But if you had that in an ideal world, you could say, okay, you've got the antibody, we know it gives some degree of protection. We could be more comfortable having those people go back to work, especially if they're younger. We need better testing. We need more testing. Jim, do you have any comments about any of those issues?
Not anything more substantive, Byron. I think those were all spot on. I think that everyone should just proceed cautiously. I think that your health is paramount and most important. Don't put yourself at risk. Try to watch the statements that are coming out of CDC. You've heard Dr. Fauci and others at NIH speak about what they feel is important in terms of distancing and protection. So I think the COPD community is at risk. It's usually an older group that's put you at even higher risk. So we know some of the groups, and with that underlying disease, you really want to do everything you can to stay out of harm's way.
We will get through this, guys. I know that this has been difficult. It's been difficult for all of us. We will get through this. This will take time. We will get through this. We need to stay safe until we're at that point.
Thank you for those answers. It's definitely an issue. The workplace issue is one that we're advocating on with our fellow patient advocacy organizations so that there can be policies in place that will allow people who need to take a longer time before returning to work because of underlying health conditions to do so. So stay tuned for more on that information. So I appreciate all of the great questions. We are out of time, but we do commit to making sure we get you answers for those questions. So we will work on that in the coming days and reach out to you directly. We do have your questions recorded. So as we conclude here, I just want to make sure for those who are new to the webinars that you're aware of the resources and support that is out there. You can find our updates directly from our homepage by clicking the top of the page. And we'll continue to post regular updates on our blog as well, including answers to the questions you submit, updates on the national response to coronavirus and other important issues. One of the recent updates includes a new handout covering the types of questions that someone with COPD should be discussing as they decide whether to pursue in-person care and elective procedures. So please check in often, get support others on COPD 360 Social, view new videos and blogs, and let us know how you're doing and what we can do to provide further support to the community. We have some additional credible resources for you to visit regularly. These sites are continually evolving, so we really encourage you to check them often, and you'll find some great practical action-oriented advice. So that is all the time we have for today. We do hope that you found the program valuable, and we look forward to providing updates as more vital research gets back up and running in the weeks and months to come. So thank you all for tuning in, and a special thank you to those who have or are participating in the important research we discussed today. Have a good evening and stay well.